once the worms are in the bin, okay, now it's time to start feeding them. What do they want to eat? Fruit and vegetable scraps, cooked pasta, bread, cereal where you're draining the milk. I'll say this a couple of times: no meat, no dairy. It's not that the worms won't eat it. It's just that when you open it up, you're going to smell rotten meat or rotten cheese or rotten milk, and you're going to hate it. It's going to freak you out. So don't do it. Avoid all meat and dairy in your vermicomposting bin. Coffee grounds, the worms love that. The tea leaves and the bags. Eggshells, crunch them up as small as you can. I like to put them in a paper towel and get the paper towel wet and crunch them up. That way they get the crunchy from the shells, they get the moisture, cool, moist, dark, remember, and they get more paper to eat. Paper towels and napkins are fine, as long as it's cleaned up a food mess. No, you know, like you don't want to clean up like olive oil necessarily, or motor oil or something, dirt from your windshield or something, you know. But if you cut a watermelon, you got some watermelon juice, you spilled some orange juice, and you're cleaning that with a paper towel, it's fine to throw that into the vermicomposting bin. I might moisten it up just because they want it moist. And aged manure, okay? Not the fresh stuff. Fresh stuff is too hot. And worms like it a certain temperature, so they don't want it that hot. And it also is emitting too much gas, and that's not good for them either. But once it's aged a while, then they love it. And some questions about some of this stuff. If you want to go back one real quick, let me just say, bread, people have asked me in the past, do they like moldy bread? And all I can say is absolutely. That's where worms do their best work. The moldier, the mushier, the better. That's Thanksgiving for them. So you have moldy strawberries, you pull a cucumber out and you can stick your thumb in it because it's so rotten. That's when they take over. That's when they love it. So don't worry about it being too disgusting. It's probably better for them. A couple of things they don't like are spicy and citrus. It's just too acidic for their system. And also, and I think we can go to the next one now, when you do feed them, a couple of the things to avoid are the peels. Do you want to go to the next slide? Like orange peels and stuff like that. You know, you have to think through how long will it take for something to decompose in order for it to be mushy enough for a worm to eat it. It's not that they won't eat it, but it's probably going to take years, if not months, for some orange peels, or I've seen avocado pits in vermicomposting bins before. I mean, how long is it going to take for that to get mushy? So you probably don't want to put that kind of stuff in there, just because logically it's not going to get mushy enough for them anytime soon. Once again, no animal dairy products because it's going to stink. No. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, something came up that said I was muted. No yard waste because you don't want to start replicating composting inside your bin, because compost heats up and the worms don't want it that hot. Let's see, and here's the #1 tip for feeding your worms, I think is an #1 tip. And this is why I feed them once a week, is to take your food scraps that you have, put them in a bucket and find room in your freezer and freeze them. So that once a week when you're feeding your worms, you're giving them frozen food scraps. So why is that good? Well, one, the majority of the time we live in a hot environment, a dry, hot environment. So when I say cool, moist, dark, and you're putting something in there frozen, you're cooling it down for them. You're refrigerating, you know, you're air conditioning their little space. So that's good. Secondly, if it's frozen, as it starts to melt, it drips. So you're adding moisture. So that's good. The third thing is, if something freezes and as it defrosts, you know how it gets mushy? You know how like a watermelon, like it's all of a sudden like ruptures and get mushy? Well, the worms want it mushy. So that's good. So now as it ruptures and defrosts, it's easier for them to eat. And here's a really good reason, probably the most important reason, is, excuse me, I'm sorry. You guys don't think about fruit flies much because you wash your fruit and you eat it. But fruit flies do exist, especially on things that you don't wash, like let's say a banana peel, because you're eating the inside of the banana. You don't think about washing the peels. Or watermelon rind, because you're eating the inside of the watermelon, so you don't necessarily wash the outside. Well, fruit flies know that. They lay eggs on those things. You put them in your vermicomposting bin, and one day you're going to open it up if you didn't freeze it ahead of time or wash it really well, and you're going to open it up and there's going to be fruit flies everywhere. They're going to be flying out of there. And so if you want to avoid that, my advice is to freeze it ahead of time. It'll kill all the eggs and whatever is attached to your fruit, vegetables, all those scraps. But also it'll add moisture, it'll cool it, it'll make it mushier. So, and one more comment on the bottom, not to feed, because we did say aged manure is okay, but feces is never okay. Obviously the difference between feces and manure is feces is a carnivore or an omnivore. It has pathogens in it that you don't want to pass along into your compost. And manure is an herbivore, you know, a vegetarian, and it doesn't have the same pathogens in it. So you don't have to worry about it if it's manure, but you don't want to put feces in there. Okay, next slide. So there is something called the zone feeding method, which is a way to be very organized and anal in how you manage your worm bin. I think it's sort of self-evident the way it's shown here. You start by putting food there 1 week, and you start by putting food in zone 2. Next week, you know, zone 3. I've tried it. It's not super successful for me. I find the worms kind of move it all around anyway, but I mention it because it is a way that some people like it. And more importantly, I mention it because I just want to remind you guys that everybody has their own way to compost. There is no real wrong way if it works for you. I obviously want you to follow some of the basic rules, but if you like doing it this way, do it. And if you don't, then don't. It's whatever works for you. It's a little bit composting, vermicomposting is a little bit like cooking. I can ask 10 people their chocolate chip cookie recipes and I might get 10 different answers. And I bet everybody's chocolate chip cookies are really good. And so composting is a little bit, you kind of have your own nuance, and that's fine. Same with vermicomposting. Do what works for you. Just follow the basics, at least at the beginning. So next slide. So how do you know when it's ready to harvest? For me, it's the weight of it. When I pick it up and I'm like, oh, it's getting heavy, I feel like it's time to harvest. So what do? So what I do is, first off, I start as if I am making a new compost bin. I strip up the paper, I get it moist, I am ready to start a new compost bin. Secondly, I dump onto, I have a glass top table and I put a sheet over it. A lot of people like plastic, that's fine. Put something over it and dump it upside down. And then while it's upside down, you're gonna see all those worms that were on the bottom are now on the top. And what they're gonna start doing is crawling down to the bottom. They hate the light, right? You can even divide it up into like 4 quadrants or something, make little volcanoes or something if you want, just however you want to do it. Excuse me, I split it up into a couple of like 4 quadrants. But what you're gonna do while they're crawling down is you're gonna get your new bin ready. So you had your old bin, you dumped it upside down, okay? Now you're gonna wash it out, clean it out, just kind of like give it a rinse. Start with your bottom bucket again, put about a ½ inch of water on it. So it starts with the, has a little bit of water that the leachate will drip into. Put the new one, the clean one into it on the top and put that newspaper bedding back in it, okay? The newspaper bedding is now going to be where you're going to take your worms that are in this, all these castings that you just dumped on the table, and you're going to put them back into your new compost bin, right? Or your redone compost bin, okay? So what you've done when you dumped it upside down, you did it into 4 quadrants. All the worms are going to start crawling to the bottom because they don't want the light. So on the top, you're gonna see it's really easy to start getting some castings. And what I do is I get like a Ziploc bag or something, and I just start putting it in the Ziploc bag. And as I come across a worm, I pick up the worm and I put it on top of the bedding that I made in my redone bin. And so the top is pretty easy. Once you get to the middle and the bottom, you're gonna have a lot of worms. It takes more time. I would dedicate at least a couple of hours to this. You don't need to get every worm or every casting separated. You can kind of do a little bit in bunches, but you want a nice bag full, a nice Ziploc bag full of castings when you're done, or if you put it in a bucket or whatever you're putting it in, a pail. And you want that separate from the worms. You want the worms in the in your redone bin. And then once again, once that's done, you put your blanket, your moist blanket on top of the worms. You put your lid, you put it back where it belonged, and you can start feeding them again in another week or so. And meanwhile, you have a nice bag of worm castings, which is the best plant food in the world. Gardeners live for this stuff, pay a lot of money for it. So you're making the stuff that people are paying a lot of money to go to nurseries and buy. Next slide. So how do you use them? You can use them as a soil additive, which means you can put a very thin layer on your soil and then water it really well. And those nutrients will seep into your soil. Or you can use it for your garden or your potted plants. However, you can't put it directly. I don't like this picture much because it looks like we're putting castings directly on it. You don't want to put directly on your plants. First off, you want to mix it. 4 parts potting soil, 1 part worm castings. These things are so high in nutrients that they can actually burn plants. They can actually kill them. If put on, like if it's treated like soil, you can't plant something in worm castings. You don't want to just put worm castings. You want to mix it with soil, 4 parts potting soil, 1 part worm castings. Mix that up really well, and then you can use it as potting soil. And it's much better potting soil than plant food. Plant food feeds the plants. Compost feeds the soil. So this makes the soil healthy. It's much better. Or you can do something called worm tea. It's not drinkable. It's not anything you're going to want to drink. Worm tea is take those castings. Remember, you had a nice Ziploc bag full of castings, and put them in a pillowcase or like a cheesecloth, and then get a bucket and fill it with water. Dunk that pillowcase or that cheesecloth in your bucket and walk away for 24 hours. When you come back, that bucket is a nicely diluted worm tea. It's great and healthy for your plants. You can now pour the water directly into your potted plants, into your garden, whatever you want to do. If it's looking too dark, you want it to look like iced tea. If it's too dark, maybe you made it too strong, but normally it comes out diluted well enough. And you can pour it directly into your potted plants. So that's worm tea. And then now you've pulled out the pillowcase or cheesecloth, and now you have the worm castings again, which you can mix into your potting soil. Next slide. Leachate. Remember how I said the leachate's going to drip through? Well, when you did your harvest, you had a bucket full of leachate. You can use, what I would do is it's the same thing, ratio 4:1. If I have 2 inches of leachate in my bottom, or 3 inches or whatever, then I make sure and pour like 12 inches of water, do a 4:1 ratio, so that I've diluted it well enough, and then I can walk around with my vermicomposting bin and pour it directly next to my roses or my fruit trees or whatever. So leachate is just like worm castings. Make sure it's diluted, 4 parts to 1, 4 parts water, 1 part leachate, and go around and feed your plants.